Welcome to this edition of Labor Vision. Hi, I'm Bob Delaney, Executive Director of the Institute for Labor Studies and Research. Labor Vision, a production of the Institute, focuses on topics of importance to working Rhode Island families. This evening's edition will host Legislative Issues with Jim Parisi, where we bring the legislature into your living room. We hope you enjoy this edition of Legislative Issues and Labor Vision.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Labor Vision, where we bring the General Assembly right into your living room. My name is James Parisi. I'm a field representative with the Rhode Island Federation of Teachers and Health Professionals, and I'm your host this evening. Tonight we continue our series of shows recapping the recent 2015 legislative session, and we're pleased to have a senator with us who was deeply involved in the issue of school construction. Senator Ryan Pearson, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate coming down.
Sure. So I know you were heavily involved in the school construction issue, but, but before we talk about that, let's talk about you for a little bit.
Sure.
As politicians often don't mind. I like asking my guests the first time they're on my show how they got involved in politics.
Well, it seems that you actually don't know this, so I think it's actually an interesting background start. My first real active involvement in the town of Cumberland and locally where I represent was actually when I was still a high school student, and we were campaigning as students for a $30 million bond, one of the last bonds issued under the old school construction program, to actually renovate Cumberland High School and many of the other schools across our town. And we campaigned much like you would for anything else. We went out to the public. We did ads and door knocks and community dinners and tours of the building, and was able to actually get that bond referendum passed to spend the $30 million in school facilities in Cumberland. And through that, I obviously got a lot of the hands-on experience, and also sort of my first election, even though my name wasn't on the ballot, an issue that I was working hard on was. And that progressed, and as I became through college and started to see somewhat of I was unhappy, I guess I could say, with some of the ways in which the school committee was managing that project we worked so hard on, and so I ran for the school committee. Served.
How old were you at the time you ran?
I was 19 when I started the election. I think I was elected when I was 20.
Mm-hmm.
And
you were still in college?
I was still in college.
Still
at the
at
time.
PC?
Still at Providence College.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And so I got elected to the school committee. Served there for a few years, and then ultimately made the jump and decided to run for the Senate. Really driven at that time by a lot of the things we were trying to do at the school committee level. We kept bumping into a state law or state funding, and so many of the issues that we were fighting were actually, very much tied to the state, and it prompted me to run for the office. And it's funny kind of how we've seen some of the issues that were big then, school construction, school funding formula, really a lot of the things that we're continuing to see today be issues that we continue to work on, but we've made a lot of progress, and especially in this last budget year, a lot of progress.
Sure. So you live in Cumberland. Is that District 19? Is that
yes.
all in Cumberland?
Cumberland and Lincoln.
Mm-hmm.
So I have almost all of Cumberland, about 90% or so, and then swing over and pick up the southern part of Lincoln as well.
Yeah. Did you talk about education issues when you were first campaigning for the Rhode Island Senate?
Yeah, and probably as a majority of the issues, because I was coming from a school committee. And I think one of the really great things that you have is members of either the Senate or the House that have served locally on a school committee or on a town council. It just gives you a much better framework to start, and you kind of understand the impact of what you do, and you just understand the impact of the funding, and you understand the impact to students and to teachers on the education side, but even municipal employees and property taxpayers on the town side. So I think it's a great foundation to serve from. And so certainly when you first enter the legislature, you actually start from that frame of reference. And you start from, you see things as how that's going to impact a school district, how that's going to impact a city or town. And then one of the things I've learned over the last 3-4 years now in the Senate has been also how we impact the business community and how we impact nonprofits. And so you begin to see that really at the legislature level in the state, there is no industry or no part that we don't play a role in either making a great environment or a poor one.
Sure. So the issue of school construction and renovation has been with us for a long time, but in the recent past on a statewide level, we've had a moratorium on school construction and renovation for almost 4 years. Why don't you let our viewers know what your interest was in the school construction issue and how you first got involved in addressing the issue of the moratorium and the way we fund school construction?
Sure, and I think it's important to remember why the moratorium was put on. And so if you go back to, really, it was in some of the worst budget years and the downturn of the economy and the banking crisis that had an effect nationally, statewide, and certainly locally to many towns, cities, families. And as we looked, as the state, and I wasn't in the assembly at the time, I was probably actually on the school committee at the time, the fiscal obligations of the current school construction program were just ballooning out of control. And there weren't really any regulations or ways to say what's truly necessary versus what's not. How do we control our cost? How do we be smart about how we finance it? There really wasn't anything. And so the state, in many ways, was forced to place that moratorium on school construction. And what had happened had been, every year or every couple of years, as the moratorium came up, it had to be extended because there really was, there wasn't an extra $100 million sitting around in any budget year to go invest in schools. And so as I began to think after my first term, or my first year, I should say, I was elected in November, we served January through June, and kind of learned my ropes, and I went to the Senate President in the summer and I said, I need a project. And as I've looked on what are some of the big issues that are going to be coming up next year, school construction, I think, is a huge issue that we keep sort of pushing off because we haven't figured out what the answer is yet, and we need to come up with the answer. And the Senate President was absolutely very amenable to doing that. She thought it was a great idea and was incredibly supportive in sort of starting the task force and starting the work that we began to finally be able to address the issue in this year's budget.
What did the task force consist of, and what did the task force focus on?
So what we wanted to do is get some good representation. So we made sure that we had a really great group of senators that were on it that really brought different aspects to it. And I think whether you had Senator Satchel, who's a fellow educator, Senator Conley, who's a lawyer, Senator Ariano, who's just a great person to talk things through with, and also Senator Metz. We had a really a good group of senators that were dedicated to the issue and making sure that it got done. But we also wanted to include school committee chairs, and we wanted to include finance directors and people who work on this issue day in and day out and are a lot closer to it than even myself. And so we asked, being from Cumberland, I always like to bring our reps up every once in a while. And so the Cumberland School Committee Chair, Lisa Bolio, served. Finance Director from the City of Woonsocket, Tom Bruce. The Pawtucket Superintendent of Schools. We really tried to get a good group. Nick Heeman, who's the Vice President of Providence School Board, we're all on it. And so we had a really great team of kind of different perspectives and people looking at it. And what we really tried to answer was a few simple questions. What have we done? Why did we do it? What do other states do? And can we be smarter about this and how we structure the program? And then where do we find the money to do it? And that's kind of the framework we looked at and just tried to handle it methodically. And we moved through the work pretty quickly. We had, I don't remember now, probably 3 to 5 full hearings on the issue. We brought in experts from around the country and asked them what other states do, and sort of began to model what we wanted to do for Rhode Island from that, and began to issue our recommendations from there.
And what were some of the recommendations that your task force came up with?
So as we looked at what other states did, and it's always a good proxy that you can use, and not saying that any state has a perfect, and I think actually in school construction no state has a perfect, and that was the testimony we received for some of the experts that we brought in. States used very different mechanisms. They either had no help to cities, towns, or counties for school construction. They did things like we did around, you issue a bond and the state helps to repay that bond. They did direct financing where the state just paid. They all had different combinations, and some did one and plus another. And what really came out of it was no state's done it perfectly, and every state has problems, but the state that's come the closest to making it the best is actually just our neighbor to the north, Massachusetts. And so we really looked at Massachusetts' model and for many ways wanted to emulate it. And because from what we were learning and what we learned about what other states were going through, they really had thought through the issues that were in front of them. And so we tried to model after Mass. And Mass, from a history perspective, was in the same position that Rhode Island was when they began their school building authority. They were where we were last year. They had lots of unfunded liabilities from projects they authorized and never paid for, which thankfully we didn't have, but they had that. Plus they had a huge pent-up of demand. And so we really felt dedicating the resources within a school building authority, not making it a subdivision of a division of something that's relegated, but making it a priority and elevating the level of the appointees and creating a school building authority was really, really important. And so I think that's the biggest one that we learned. And some of the other things that we learned were the way we financed was terrible. Through the Department of Education's estimation, 40% or 40 cents on every dollar that we were spending on school construction was going to pay interest cost.
Right.
And that obviously means that that's 40% of the money that's not going into actually building schools. And that's not a smart or something you want to continue financing model. And so that was another big recommendation, that we restructured how the programs would work to be able to decrease that interest cost.
Which would have to be done over time because of all the immediate projects want to get done, need to get done.
Yes.
You need to find a way to have capital to get it done quickly.
Correct. And you want to take advantage of the market. And so, first of all, you have a lot of debt from prior projects that we're still rolling off, and we're going to see that trail down over the time. And we can refinance those bonds just like you would for your home and get a lower get a little rate on that, just like you would a lower mortgage rate. And so we've done that, and that's part of a lot of the refunding that's been happening to save money on debt service. And that portfolio will roll off over time. We've also added in an influx of capital, one-time capital, that's actually being paid for from the governor's proposal around refunding and refinancing some bond debt. So that's where we're getting a lot of that one-time capital. And then also, because money is so cheap right now, the Fed has continued to keep the rates low. We see that on our homes. We will see that on bonds. And so there is somewhat of a timing of the market right now that there's a little bit less pressure to completely get off a bonding mechanism because the rates are so low and the money is so cheap than it would be to do 4 years, 5 years, 6, however long years it is until rates turn again.
Sure. Certain practicality that has to be taken into consideration, right?
It's true, because there's things that have to get done today. And while we do have an influx of cash and capital that we're able to put out there immediately for projects, we try to scale them down to the smaller projects that we can move quickly. And for the larger projects, in this period of time, what we're looking to is to still authorize the bonding while rates are low, but absolutely as we go forward in the future, we're going to continue to really monitor that interest cost, and we're going to have to, over time, decrease that reliance on bonding. Very similar to what was done with the Department of Transportation several years back.
Right. So to complete the political story here, you had a task force, wholly within the Senate, came up with some recommendations, and then there was legislation introduced to implement it. Similarly, we had the governor, the newly elected governor, wanting to tackle this issue as well and put in a budget article. And how did it all come together?
So we began the task force, so it'd be at the end of 2013, and we completed our findings in about January, February, probably a little bit later than that, probably March of 2014. At that point, we then had to convert it into legislative language, which, as you know, but probably many people don't know, is harder than you may think. What is good in ideas, and we can all understand it, turning it into legislative language is difficult sometimes. So we took some time to do that, and we had the final version legislatively probably done by about May. So it took a decent amount of time to get from beginning to end when it comes through. And
the session was coming to a close the following month, right?
And so, and since, we do adjourn in January, the budget, come the end of May is in a very precarious position. And so the decision we had to make at the time, and as much as I didn't want to be supporting that, was to allow the moratorium to be extended one more year. And so we knew the recommendations, and we had the school building authority and everything ready to go in May of 2014, but because of the timing and the way our budget cycle begins, and because the budget begins July 1st, it just was infeasible to have it completely off the ground and everything changed within 30 days because there's a lot of administrative stuff and other things behind that as well. So we took that off session to really build consensus, and that was something that we had to work on, because as you mentioned, it was a Senate task force, and so we had to begin talking with members of the House and gaining interest on the House side around the issue. I think it was kind of one of those things that we knew about, but wasn't a big issue, and so we had to do that. Certainly, as candidates for governor at the time, were coming up and talking to me or having breakfast or whatever it was as we were talking about their candidacies for governor. It was the one topic I talked to every candidate about. And certainly I think Governor Raimondo absolutely was a big champion, and she then came out in her campaign talking a lot about it as well.
Right.
And so that was sort of the fall and the winter in building that consensus. The governor won her election, and she called me, I think, a day or two after, to thank for the support that we had provided, and we're happy to. And I made sure at the time I said, Governor, I said, listen, I know you're still in celebratory mode, but as soon as you get out of that and are ready, I'd love to talk to you about school construction, and we have to get it done. So it's the continual plug.
Persistence is how politics works. That's how you make a difference in this world.
That's the way it goes. And so sure enough, come January, we introduced the legislation again. We did make some modifications from feedback we received over the fall and the winter. So again, it was a good period of time where we had changes and adjustments made. And we came up with what was the Senate's proposal. That then became a very big part of the Senate President's conversations with the governor as she was drafting her budget. The governor had asked for some feedback in different areas. We were happy to provide it.
Right.
I think the governor in her budget issued a bold sort of statement. She put it in her budget, which was incredibly important that she put it in her budget so we could find the funding for it. And we continue to work with the governor's office and then the House over the next several months on a piece here, a piece there, to make it all come together, and we're really happy that it did and it passed.
And in quick layman's terms, what was this budget article? In addition to creating the building authority, let our viewers know how this now works compared to how it used to work.
Yeah. So the building authority is created, which will administer two separate programs. The old program that was focused around bond debt issuance to pay for construction projects, but also a new capital fund that is meant for smaller projects that aren't a new school or a major renovation, but are the roof needs to be replaced, the boiler needs to be replaced. These are these quick things that we can do faster, and if we're maintaining these systems and replacing them, it will save us money in the long run, right?
And her budget provided some funding for this school year.
Absolutely.
Fiscal year.
For this fiscal year coming, absolutely. And so school districts can apply for that, and it's something that is actually really great because they can achieve the state reimbursement from that. They're not, they don't have, it's not just borrowing. They can also receive a grant. They can receive the state reimbursement. The school building authority is going to be issuing the regulations on exactly how they're going to make the program work and how the application works. But most importantly, and I think one of the things we learned from Massachusetts, and one of the things that was most important to me, is we wanted a program that legislatively was flexible. Because what we found is the old system was you do it this way or you get nothing from the state. And that way hadn't been updated, and I couldn't tell you how long. And we wanted something that really gave the School Building Authority Advisory Board, which consists of the General Treasurer, the Director of Administration, and others that are on that board, the ability to say, okay, that was great then, but give them the ability to change the program, change what types of things are reimbursed, and just be able to move more quickly to get schools fixed rather than everything has to be a 2-3 year process where you have to go and get bonds, and we want to be able to fix schools faster.
So the moratorium has ended.
Yes.
There's an infusion of cash to get some projects going, particularly some short-term projects.
Yep.
And we have a new governance system in terms of how school construction is overseen. And,
yes.
and we also have some new regulations on how this all works, don't we?
We do, and that's actually what's important about that. I'm glad you brought that up, is we've also tried to give some incentives to local communities to really begin to think about what I call their real estate footprint. And sometimes we have schools that are way too big or way too small or way too outdated, and they turn into pretty tight political issues in communities around which schools should be changed, renovated, expanded, closed. But at the end of the day, we have a ton of excess capacity in Rhode Island, and it's costing us money. and it's costing cities and towns money, it's costing the state money. And so we've tried to give incentives to communities to address the extra space that they have and really try to make sure that they have space that is enough for the students they have, but we don't have 20, 30, 40% excess capacity in buildings, because that's 20, 30, 40% more we're paying to maintain, heat, have electricity. And so that's one of the other things that we really tried to do through the regulation side of it, is encourage those communities to begin doing that.
Sure. And from my standpoint, this program is one of the most significant things that came out of last session of the General Assembly.
I would definitely agree. I think there were a lot of big things that came out, but I would put this in in the top 5 list. I think there was obviously a lot of stuff around job creation and economic incentives, but I would, especially to this audience, I think, absolutely building schools and construction schools is incredibly important to our labor industries and making sure we get them back to work. And so, it's a huge project that will not just pay dividends this year, but continue to pay dividends in the out years as well.
Sure. Well, Senator, I appreciate your time coming to tell this important story to our viewers. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
And thank you for joining us for this edition of Labor Vision.
Like many students and faculty at the Schmidt Labor Research Center, Matt Boda had a work life long before he got to us. He was an engineering technician at the Rhode Island Department of Transportation from 1984 to 1988. And if there's any greater launching pad to success than RIDOT, I don't know what it is. Now, Matt was very active in his union early in his career. It was a small professional employees group which had disaffiliated from the Rhode Island AFL-CIO. And Matt, through argumentation and persuasion, got that union to re-affiliate with the labor body in the state, George, and you can owe that to Matt. While he was working at the Department of Transportation, Matt earned a bachelor's degree at Providence College, graduating magna cum laude. I thought that was a pasta sauce. Magna cum laude. That was in 1986. 2 years later, he had an MS degree, a master's degree in labor and industrial relations at the Labor Research Center in 1988. And notice I said an MS degree. That science degree makes us very high paid as opposed to other people who do the same work that we do. Matt, one of the very few people in our program over the years, then applied to graduate school for a PhD, in this case, Michigan State, in industrial relations, where he got his degree in 1996. He was then called back to URI, very unusually, and became an instructor there in 1992, even while he was working on his doctoral degree, and reached the status of full professor in 2010. Now, it's very unusual in the academic world to be called back to your home base. I remember there was a televangelist who used to say he was going to be called home, but he never went home fast enough, in my opinion. Matt has just finished a 5-year stint as the chairperson of the economics department at URI. Economics, I can't balance my checkbook yet. Along the way, Matt also taught at times at Michigan State, at the University of Massachusetts, and at several universities in Germany. I hope they spoke English, Matt. Now, one of the things when you introduce a good friend, somebody you've known for a long time, you always have to be careful that there isn't some major accomplishment, achievement, event in their lives that you don't know about. How many times do we talk to our friends and say, I never knew that? Oh, but I made the cardinal academic mistake. I asked Matt Boda for his resume. Oh, don't ever ask an academic for their resume. The UPS trucks will be coming up your driveway for a week. 13 pages both sides. Oh, leave something out. Well, I can give this to you alphabetically or chronologically. Actually, I'm just going to give you a couple little pieces of it. Journal publications by Matt, 15. Articles and academic proceedings, 7. 3 book chapters, 11 publication reports, book reviews, an editorial volume, 32 high-ranking academic presentations around the country, $1 million in grants to URI to help out not only labor, but also in some business ventures. Also is service and outreach with projects with business and unions. There's not enough fingers on all of us to count them all. He helped everybody who came to his door. Providence College in 2011 awarded him with a Father Quirk Award, and boy, there you need to know your labor history. And URI gave him the Administrative Excellence Award in 2012. And some professors ask, does that guy really have a job? Does he work? You know, academics, as I end up here, academics sit on a 3-legged stool. We do outreach, helping people outside the university. We do research so that we can help the world along. And we're supposed to be good at teaching. And I have to tell you, most professors excel at 1 or 2 of those. But Matt has only what we call in Rhode Island a trifecta. He does it all. In concluding, let me say that Matt's also a professional arbitrator, and he's respected by both labor and management and sought out by both sides because he's a fair and just person who went to Our Lady of Providence High School. Matt, with all of that, it's my great pleasure as my former student and my good friend and colleague to induct you into the Rhode Island Labor History Society Hall of Fame. Come on, listen. The elder buses out there right now.
Well, it's a decidedly mixed blessing to follow that, let me tell you. I want to thank Scott for that incredible introduction, and I think that's literally incredible, not to be totally believed. So I've known Scott for almost 30 years. He's been my teacher, my colleague, my friend, and if not for Scott's mentorship early in my life, I would not have had the career that I've had, so I'll always be grateful to him.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Labor Vision. We appreciate your input and encourage your comments. Labor Vision can be seen on this channel 3 times each week: Tuesday at 7 p.m., Thursday at 8 p.m., and Saturday at 5 p.m.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Labor Vision, where we bring the General Assembly right into your living room. My name is James Parisi. I'm a field representative with the Rhode Island Federation of Teachers and Health Professionals, and I am your host this evening. Today we continue our series of discussions post-session. The 2015 General Assembly session is now behind us, and we're talking to several different guests about different issues, and today we're going to talk about a real interesting issue on the tip minimum wage with Senator Gail Golden. Senator, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So before we talked about the tip minimum wage issue, a legislative success for you, I just wanted to remind our viewers that we had you on the show about a year and a half ago talking about the, or even less than that, talking about the temporary caregiver insurance legislation that you put in, where you expanded the ability of workers who use TDI to be able to use it to care for individuals on a short-term basis. So why don't you take a minute and talk about how that bill has been working out, and I know there's some recent federal developments. You could let our viewers know about that as well.
Sure. So in 2013, the legislature passed, and then Governor Chafee signed into law the creation of temporary caregiver insurance, which expanded our temporary disability insurance program in Rhode Island, which we've had. Workforce has had in Rhode Island since 1942. We were the first in the country to do that. And we were the third in the country to expand that leave to create paid family leave so that people can take time off to care for a seriously ill loved one or welcome a new child into their home through birth, adoption, or foster care. California and New Jersey were the two states that had done it before us, and our bill was modeled off of their legislation, and also they're learning from their experiences of what worked well and what we could do better in the state. And so one of the unique aspects of the Rhode Island law is that we have job protection. So that means if you take this 4 weeks of time off because you need it, you are certain that your job will be there when you get back. And that is critically important because certainly when you're going through a life crisis in particular, you want to know that you have the money in your pocket to be able to pay the bills and know that you won't lose your job at the end of it. So, I'm really pleased with that. It has been very successful program. We saw in the first year several thousand families were use the program predominantly for caregiving of a new child leave, and we sometimes refer to that as bonding leave, to care for a new child in their home. But a good chunk of people also used it to take care of a seriously ill loved one. And we certainly know with the aging population in Rhode Island, that can be a very stressful time, and it's critically important that people be able to take that time out of work to be able to afford it and take that time and return to their workplace. So it has been great. There has been a team at University of Rhode Island who have been working with the Department of Labor and Training to do some pretty extensive research on what the benefits have been just looking at the first year benefits, and also helping DLT understand how to improve systems, because there's always room for improving how the process is going to work.
Sure.
And that has been great. And that was funded through a federal grant from the U.S. Department of Labor. And yesterday, the U.S. Department of Labor announced that we are the only place in the country to receive second-year funding of that, which I'm really excited about. It will allow us to do additional piloting of outreach, because what the evaluators found was that there were certain groups of people who are less likely to know that they had this leave. And we want to make sure everybody knows it. You pay for it, so you should be able to use it if you need it. We want people to know it exists. So in order to do some outreach, and then also to look at ways that we can expand the benefits, either additional hours, add in, or additional weeks, add in who else it can cover. And so we're really excited about that.
Because it's paid for by the workers through a payroll deduction, people probably forget that they even contribute to their disability insurance program, and I could certainly see why an education component would be necessary, because if people don't know about a benefit, they're not going to take advantage of it. But everyone needs to know that it's the workers, it's not the employer or the state, it's the workers who are paying for this benefit.
Absolutely. It's fully funded by working people in Rhode Island, and so you're paying for that benefit, and yet at the same time it's a little box on your paycheck in the corner beside all the other little boxes, and people kind of forget that that's what that money goes for. And because this is a new program of expanding on the paid family leave part of it, we want to make sure people understand how and when to use that and how to access it.
Have you heard from legislators in other states who are taking a look at what you've done here in Rhode Island?
Oh, absolutely. You know, they're across the country. Yesterday, when the U.S. Department of Labor announced those grants, I believe they had 17 states apply for funding to look at how to create paid family leave in their states. They awarded 8 grants, but there's clearly a growing interest across our country. You know, when the president was here in October of last year, a year ago, you know, he came to Rhode Island to talk about paid family leave and say, look, this is time. It's not an if question, this is a when question. And this was really a kickoff on behalf of the White House and their administration to figure out how the way we can make states make it possible for more states to be able to create paid family leave.
And it would be nice if the federal government took on this issue. I'm hopeful. I'm always hopeful that this issue may seep itself into our upcoming presidential election.
I'm hopeful too. I mean, we've certainly seen Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders have talked about it. You know, I think it is something that resonates with people across political lines. You know, needing to take care of somebody else knows no political boundary. It's just the way our lives exist now, and in terms of our work lives and our home lives. And, you know, people really care about this issue, and it knows no political boundaries in every other country around the world. So, you know, I'm really hopeful that we'll be able to see change. There certainly is legislation introduced in Congress. Congresswoman DeLauro from Connecticut has really been leading the charge, as well as Senator Gillibrand in New York, to introduce the Family Act, which is modeled off of California, New Jersey, and Rhode Island's programs. But as we know, most of the action is happening in the states now, and so that may be the way we get this done for most people.
Which is a good segue for me, because the other issue we're going to talk about is the minimum wage, and there's been no movement on increasing the federal minimum wage, which is $7.25. There has been no movement for a long time, so this state, like a lot of other states, has gone ahead and increased their minimum wage over time. Now, the general minimum wage for Rhode Island is going up to $9.60 an hour January. But there's another aspect of our minimum wage law that you worked on this year, and there's a good chance a lot of our viewers don't know about it. So why don't you start by just explaining to our viewers how this minimum wage for tip workers works?
You know, a lot of people call it a sub-minimum wage or a tipped minimum wage. Some people call it a tip credit. But essentially, the way our law exists is that we have a minimum wage, and it will be $9.60 is our coming up raise. But we have a minimum wage, and then we have a tip minimum wage, which is $2.89 an hour. And that means that if you work in a tipped industry, and that's predominantly restaurant workers, but there are other tipped workers in our state, your employer is required to pay you that tipped minimum wage as long as your tips add up to the minimum wage in theory. So in theory, you make the minimum wage by people who are tipping you directly paying you. It is it's an unusual way of getting paid. You know, most of us expect that the tip we are leaving is truly a gratuity. It's a thank you for good service, as opposed to the way that the worker is making their day-to-day salary.
And the tip minimum wage, or sub-minimum wage, as I used to often call it, is low. It's currently $2.89 an hour. No one can live on that.
Exactly, and we've had it there for 20 years. You know, one of the things that amazed me was, even in thinking about that, you think 20 years. Well, the minimum wage, when we had a tip minimum wage of $2.89, was $4.45 an hour. So we have really been pushing, and I think it's great, we've been raising that, the top minimum wage, the one that everybody usually talks about, gradually over the past several years. And while that certainly is advantageous for many workers in the state, we've left out a whole group of people by only raising the top. And in some ways, that leaves them even more vulnerable to really being affected in a negative way by sexual harassment, by their employers taking advantage of them. A whole host of power dynamics really get into play here, because what we're saying is, instead of going from $2.89 to $4.45, so that's, I'm not doing the math here, $1.60 or something. You know, in tips, I mean, that's a whole totally different thing in expecting somebody to make $1.60 an hour in tips versus making $7 an hour in tips. So we're really addressing an inequity when we raise the tip minimum wage.
So what was the legislation that you first introduced? You know, before we talk about what passed, what was your initial goal when you made a foray into this issue this session?
The bill that I introduced, which actually had many co-sponsors in both the Senate and the House, that bill would have gradually raised the tip minimum wage over the course of the next few years or so, in order to eliminate the tip minimum wage, and so that everybody would be a minimum. Anybody who works at the minimum wage works at the same minimum wage. You know, there are, I believe, 7 states that have eliminated the tip minimum wage and only have the minimum wage for all workers, restaurant workers, everybody, and people still make tips and make plenty of money as tip workers, make plenty of tips off of those. So, you know, that was really our goal when we set about this legislation, was to address this inequity, try and eliminate some of the ways that people are kept in poverty because of the tip minimum wage, and create a more equitable system.
And you ran into some opposition. I know that the restaurant industry itself was organized in opposition to it. And at the end of the day, there was some legislative compromise. Let our viewers know what happened with the bill this year.
So the compromise is the wage is being increased by $1 over the course of 2 years. So it's going up 50 cents and then 50 cents the next year. You know, that's obviously any raise. When you wait 20 years, any raise is certainly a good first step. And I have been told that this is the first time in Rhode Island that we've even addressed a minimum wage bill of any sort over the course of 2 years. So I do feel that that is a very strong first step. I think that there is so much left to be done, because it's not only just about wages for particularly a tipped workforce, you know, and a low-income workforce to begin with. But I am happy that we've at least seen this increase. We'll see this increase of $1 over the course of the two years.
And I know it's not solely restaurant workers, but as you've said, it's primarily or predominantly restaurant workers impacted by this. Has your legislation generated some discussion about how we pay people in the first place? I know other places, other countries don't, you know, workers in that industry don't rely on tips for a living. They get a living wage initially.
Exactly, and you know, even in states where we do, like California, where they don't have a tipped minimum wage and people are still tipping them, that means that they're putting this workforce into a living wage, and recognizing that there's professionalism in the industry. I think by making it solely based on tips, we've really diminished and devalued the work of restaurant workers in particular, which is problematic. And you're right, there are many countries where the reason people are surprised if you leave a tip, as Americans do when they're traveling overseas, is because they are paid living wages and receive healthcare benefits and are considered a professional workforce and are treated as such. So certainly, yes, there have been discussions about that. Across our country, there have been restaurants who have eliminated tipping altogether. There's a restaurant, I think, in Philadelphia that announced that they collectively decided that their whole workforce, everybody would make $35,000 a year in the restaurant and get benefits and retirement. And that has meant that they have removed a lot of disparity about who's going to get what shift, or concerns about what the kitchen staff is making versus the front staff. So there are many different ways that we could address this issue, but it's certainly something that we need to talk about.
And it looks like your legislation really initiated a discussion. This legislation this year that passed isn't the end of the discussion, is it?
No, it certainly isn't, and I look forward to having more conversations. I know that many people have thanked me for introducing this legislation because it's been meaningful to them. Many people who have worked in the restaurant industry at some time in their career are also really appreciative, even if they're no longer in that workforce. But it's a way that I think we're having a conversation about how do we create a better work environment and how do we address income inequality in Rhode Island.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. I'd like to congratulate you for having successfully shepherded through 2 significant pieces of worker-related legislation in just 3 years of time served in the General Assembly.
Thank you.
Yeah, and we look forward to a future show. Perhaps we can have you come back and we can talk about other different aspects of what's going on with tipped workers and what kind of legislation would address it.
Great, thank you.
And thank you for joining us for this edition of Labor Vision.
Hello, I'm Jerry O'Neill. I want to thank Maureen for that lovely introduction. I'd like to get a copy of that if I can keep it. I want to thank all my friends from Council 94 for being here today, although I have a little bad news. I know President Downey had told you you'd get overtime for coming here tonight, but I'm sorry that's not going to happen. Although President Downey did call the governor to see if he can get comp time, so that's still on the table. I'd like to say thank you for most of my staff being here tonight. You will not be disciplined tomorrow, but since this is a historical society, I thought I would share a few of maybe cogent facts of my history. I believe all labor advocates have a strong sense of fairness and justice. I believe I got mine from my parents. My father was born in Ireland in 1918. His father died later that year when he was only 9 months old. My grandfather, James, was a fighter for the Irish independence movement. My grandmother would tell us stories about these black and tans. They were not regular British troops, but they were like an army hired by the British Army to go in and terrorize Irish citizens. They would come into my grandmother's house and my father's house and stick bayonets into the walls looking for my grandfather. They did this even to a couple of years after he had died. So my grandmother growing up was never thought much of the British government. My mother was a little different in that she was born into a family that had gathered considerable wealth during the 1920s. They had a chauffeur, a maid, and they had a 13-room house in Scarsdale, New York. My grandfather had invested in aluminum and was worth over $2 million in 1928. However, after the stock market crashed, they lost everything. They went from the 13-room house to a 3-room apartment, and my mother had to quit high school to help support the family. So I think I got a lot of my experiences and developed a sense of fairness and justice from them. I graduated from Our Lady of Providence High School in 1970, several years before our other honorees Frank, and Matt graduated. Frank was behind me by a couple of years. I did not see much of Frank in high school, only when I would pass the detention room, and he was usually in there. I can't say that I saw Matt there because I think he came after I had already graduated. But there must be something about Catholic high school boys drawn to the labor movement. President Downey was also another Catholic high school boy, as were my late friends Joe Peckham and Dan Martin. I graduated at Rick in 1976 with a BA in social welfare. While attending Rick, I managed to take some time off and hitchhiked across the country 3 separate times, which kind of gave me a good idea of how big and diverse this country is. In 1977, as Maureen alluded to, I started as an institutional attendant at Ladd School and almost immediately became a union steward. And that began my relationship with AFSCME, which is now 38 years. AFSCME has been a big part of my life and really helped me to be as successful as I am. In 1980, I started law school at Knights in Boston. Our master contract provided for 35-hour employees, which I was a teacher aide, could work overtime and get 7.5 hours of comp time a week. Working full-time and going to law school was quite difficult, so I could do the overtime on days I didn't go to school, and then I could take extra days off to study. This was very beneficial to my successfully completing law school. However, in 1983, I started my 3rd year in law school. The state, for some reason, as they will often do, decided that even though the contract says you can do it, we're not going to let you do it. So we filed a grievance, and we lost at the first level, but we won at the 3rd level, and I again received my right to receive comp time. So the master contract and Local 1293 were very helpful in my successfully passing law school. And we still have that language in the contract today. In Local 1293 at Ladd Center, I learned the importance of working together with other employees for everybody's benefit. We had some great union people who fought locally and statewide for better pay and benefits for everybody. People like Dan Martin, Maureen Martin, Jerry Clancy, John Vars, Jack Palazzo, and Joe Idavaya. They were very great union leaders, and it takes a lot of good union leaders to be successful, I believe. But now I think we need dedicated leaders as much as ever, because what's going on in the real world is that the wealthy right wing is attempting to take away the American dream for the average citizen or the average employee. Public sector employees are under attack by these same people, but also we're under attack by the United States Supreme Court in the decisions they made recently and in that we expect them to make next year. So we are in a fierce battle, and it's a continuing battle, and we have to remain strong, and I think gatherings like this help us remain strong and understand how important it is, because some of our people we represent don't understand that they could lose a lot of the things that they have today. I think it's time for me to stop talking, because Maureen had told me when I spoke to her that the honoree who speaks the least amount of time gets a new car. Is that still correct?
A matchbox.
Yeah. I do want to thank the Labor History Society for this award. It's very important to me. I really appreciate it. And I want to thank again all my co-workers for coming out tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. Great job. And in addition to the award we provided, there were also certificates from Senator Sheldon Whitehouse for Jerry and the the other honorees. Please welcome to the podium for the second honoree, Rhode Island Labor History Society founder, labor leader, union member, and rosé wine drinker, Scott Malloy.
Before I get to Matt Boda, I want to say thank you to Jim Parisi, who stepped into a tough position and in a volunteer way has taken over the society and done so much of the work without ever complaining, without ever a nasty word from him, our president. And the fact that he gives me homemade wine has nothing to do with that. You know, one of the great academic challenges that teachers and professors face in our career is when you look out in your class after a couple of weeks each semester, and you look over to your left and there's a very bright young woman over there, and over to your right a smart young man, and you come to the realization that there's people out there that are smarter than you. And you've got two ways to go. You either resist or you assist. Now, I know a few professors who resist. They try to keep those people down so that no one will ever suspect that they're smarter than the teacher. But I think most of the faculty that I've dealt with all my life try to assist those people who are so smart that they are on a trajectory to greater achievement. And all we want to do is help them along to go as far as they can to set an example. Now, thank goodness in my situation there weren't many students in that position. But at the Schmidt Labor Research Center, I got to tell you, boy, the students there are a cut above, regardless of where you go. And that's true tonight for Matt Boda. It's true for Bob Walsh, Lexi, and a whole bunch of other people who are here that I really enjoyed helping them along because I knew they were indeed smarter than I was. And they were so arrogant sometimes. They would challenge me to put questions on the exam that I couldn't answer. And if anyone's ever taken a class with me, know I have a little matching pot that's only worth 20 points. Match 10 on the left, 10 on the right. Mickey Mouse. But I make sure everyone does the reading. Well, they used to bust my chops about that all the time. I got to get those 10 right. I said, all right, you want it tough, you'll get it tough. Big Bill Haywood of the Western Federation of Miners wore a patch in his eye. Was it the left or the right?
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Labor Vision. We appreciate your input and encourage your comments. Labor Vision can be seen on this channel 3 times each week: Tuesday at 7 p.m., Thursday at 8 p.m., and Saturday at 5 p.m.